Today, we're diving into a trial that did so much more than just convict one man. It actually forced the entire world to stop and rethink what justice even means. This is the story of how the televised trial of a seemingly ordinary Nazi bureaucrat, Adolf Eichmann, kicked off a global conversation about how a society can ever heal from unimaginable horror. And to really get a handle on the challenge here, just listen to this quote. It's from a journalist who is covering South Africa's attempt to heal from apartheid. And it just gets to the absolute heart of the problem, right? This overwhelming collective grief, this web of infinite sorrow. It's something that a traditional courtroom with its strict focus on facts and rules just isn't built to handle.
And that leads us right to our central question. When something horrific happens on a massive scale, what is justice actually for? Is it just about punishing the bad guys and setting a legal precedent? Or is it for something bigger, like healing an entire nation? The Eichmann trial put that exact dilemma on the world stage for everyone to see.
So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll kick things off with the incredible spy story of how Eichmann was captured. Then we'll look at the rulebook for war crimes at the time, the Nuremberg trials. From there, we'll see how the Eichmann trial basically tore up that rulebook, dive into a really powerful critique of this new approach, and finally, trace its surprising legacy all the way to how we think about justice today.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's 15 years after World War II. Nations are rebuilding, but one of the Holocaust's key organizers, a man whose name is on pretty much every most wanted list, is just gone. He's living a quiet, normal life, having vanished thousands of miles from the scene of his crimes.
That man was Adolf Eichmann. He'd managed to flee Germany, and by 1950, he pops up in Argentina. He's living under a fake name, Ricardo Clement, and he settles into this quiet, suburban life. To all his neighbors, he's just another German guy trying to start over. A ghost. The break in the case came from the most unlikely place. A German Jewish man in Argentina, Lothar Hermann, got suspicious when his daughter started dating a young man named Nicholas Eichmann, who, get this, would boast about his father's Nazi past. Hermann passed this unbelievable tip to prosecutors in Germany, and they got it to Israel's intelligence agency, the Mossad.
And you can see from this timeline, this was not a quick operation. Mossad agents were incredibly patient, running surveillance for years. The final, absolute proof came on March 21, 1960. They knew it was the Eichmann's 25th wedding anniversary, and when they saw the man they knew was Ricardo Clement celebrating, they knew they had their guy. On May 11th, they grabbed him right off the street. 9 days later, he was drugged, disguised as an airline crew member, and smuggled all the way to Israel. Now, to really understand why the Eichmann trial was such a game-changer, we have to look at the only model for justice that existed back then. Before Eichmann, the world really only had one big example of how to prosecute crimes against humanity, the Nuremberg trials.
Nuremberg was, it was historic. It created the very idea of crimes against humanity. But the Allied prosecutors were absolutely obsessed with making it look legitimate. They couldn't have anyone calling it victor's justice, so they made a really important decision. They built their entire case on a mountain of captured Nazi documents. The focus was all on rationality, cold, hard facts. Survivor testimony, with all its raw human emotion, deliberately kept out.
And this quote from the chief U.S. prosecutor Robert Jackson, it just sums up that whole philosophy perfectly. The goal was to separate the legal process from any feeling of revenge. Justice, in this model, had to be unemotional, objective, and totally by the book if it was going to be seen as real justice. And then, in 1961, the Eichmann trial begins in Jerusalem. And the lead prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, takes that Nuremberg playbook and just rips it to shreds. This was going to be something completely new. Just look at the contrast here. It's night and day. Nuremberg went after the top Nazi leaders, using documents to get convictions and set a legal precedent. But the Eichmann trial, it focused on this one mid-level manager, and its main evidence wasn't a paper trail. It was the gut-wrenching testimony of Holocaust survivors. The goal here wasn't just to convict Eichmann, it was to teach a new generation, to build a national story of what happened, and to put victims right at the very center of the story.
Hausner's opening statement says everything. For him, this trial was about so much more than Adolf Eichmann. It was about giving a voice to the millions who could no longer speak for themselves. The parade of survivors who took the stand told stories that the world had never, ever heard inside a courtroom. The trial became a kind of global classroom, and the victims, they were the teachers.
But, not everyone was sold on this new, emotional kind of justice. The trial's most famous observer was the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who covered it for The New Yorker. And she had some serious problems with what she was seeing.
Arendt looked at Eichmann sitting there in his glass booth, and she didn't see some kind of demonic monster. She saw something she thought was much, much scarier. A boring, thoughtless paper pusher. She came up with that famous phrase, the banality of evil, to describe how regular people, just cogs in a machine, could do the most monstrous things, simply by following orders and refusing to actually think.
So for Arendt, all this emotion and storytelling was dangerous. It risked turning a legal proceeding into a spectacle, a show trial. She argued that, okay, yes, the testimony was absolutely heartbreaking, but a lot of it wasn't direct evidence against Eichmann himself. She felt that the intense focus on collective suffering was distracting from the specific legal case against the one man in the dock. The witnesses she really admired were the ones she said were completely free of sentimentality. Basically, she was making a case for going back to the cold, hard facts, the Nuremberg way.
But here's the thing. That debate between the legalistic approach and the storytelling approach, it didn't just end when the verdict came in. Instead, it kicked off this profound change in how we think about justice after mass violence, a legacy that is absolutely still unfolding today.
You can actually trace a pretty clear line here. First, you've got Nuremberg, where justice is all about legal precedent and focusing on the perpetrators. Then, boom, the Eichmann trial flips the script and centers the whole thing on victims and a public narrative. And that innovation, it directly paved the way for a third model, truth commissions. These groups took the powerful idea of testimony from the Eichmann trial, but separated it from a criminal trial, reframing justice itself as a tool for healing all of society. And this whole field, it now has a name, transitional justice. It's basically the toolbox societies use to try and put themselves back together after something terrible happens. And that core idea, that the stories of victims are essential for rebuilding, that is a direct, straight-line legacy from the revolution Gideon Hausner started in that courtroom in Jerusalem. And just think about this number for a second. Over 2,000. That's how many people gave public testimony at the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the 1990s. That core idea that Hausner pioneered, that public testimony can heal a nation, was now being put into practice on a scale nobody had ever seen before. The TRC really became the textbook example of this new approach. It deliberately chose not to be a court that was focused on punishment. Instead, it was a public stage for telling the truth. Its goal wasn't just accountability, but reconciliation, an idea that would have sounded completely alien to the prosecutors back at Nuremberg. So we've traveled this incredible path, right? From a model of justice that was strictly legal, totally rational, to one that actually makes room for the emotional, the narrative, and the psychological needs of a society dealing with trauma. So what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, the Eichmann trial basically shattered the old idea that justice had to be cold and unemotional. It completely changed the role of victims. They weren't just witnesses anymore, they became teachers of history. The trial's lasting legacy is this idea that justice can be for healing an entire society, not just punishing one person. And maybe most importantly, it showed us that after huge trauma, that line between public law and private grief, well, maybe it needs to be a little blurry. And all this leaves us with one final, really big question. That debate between Arendt and Hausner, it's still very much alive. Is it really possible for a society to heal, to rebuild itself, without first creating a public space to confront all of those raw, messy emotions, the anger, the grief, the despair? The Eichmann trial didn't give us the final answer, but it forced all of us, for the very first time, to finally ask the right question.